The autumn of 1892 settled over Red Mesa, Texas, like a man who has made up his mind. The dust was red and the sky was wide, and the Whitaker name sat on the land the way a stone sits on a grave, heavy, unmoving, and meant to keep something buried. For 3 years, a young woman named Nora Finch had worked in that house. She rose before the sun, lit the stove in the dark, baked bread for a family that never asked how her hands felt at the end of the day. She laundered shirts for men who did not know her name. She swept floors that other feet dirtied without a second thought. She ate last, stood last, spoke lowest, and when the old man of the house, August Whitaker, closed his eyes for the final time, she laid out the mourning cloth and set the table for a grief that was not hers to carry. But August Whitaker had kept a secret. He had carried it like a stone in his boot for 23 years, long enough to limp from it, long enough for the pain to become ordinary. And in the final document he left behind, that secret cracked open in front of every person who had ever looked past Nora Finch, as though she were part of the furniture. The lawyer's voice was steady when he read the first provision. It did not stay steady for the second. 1/2 of Whitaker Ranch, the south water rights, the main house, the long barn, and the cattle bearing the W brand, would pass to Miss Nora Finch. This is their story, a tale of a woman the world called a servant, and the man who had to learn the difference between inheriting a house and deserving one. Now, Nora Finch was not a woman given to loud things. She was 24 years old, and she moved through the Whitaker house the way water moves through a known channel. With efficiency, with quiet, with a kind of practiced invisibility she had not chosen so much as been taught. Her dark hair was pinned low at the nape of her neck. Her eyes were a gray blue that people rarely noticed because few thought to look. Her hands told the truth, her face kept private. The knuckles roughened by lye and cold water, the palms calloused from the pump handle, the fingernails kept short because short nails do not catch on iron pots. She had grown up in a small church home 2 days' ride from Red Mesa. Her mother had died when Nora was young enough that memory blurred into impression, a warmth, a scent, a sound that could not be named. What her mother had left behind was thin, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials C.W., in thread so fine it must have taken patience the woman clearly possessed, and a photograph so faded that the face in it was more suggestion than feature. Nora had kept both. She did not know why. She did not know what C.W. meant, only that it had been her mother's, and so it was hers. She had come to Whitaker Ranch 3 years ago with a letter of recommendation from the churchwoman who had taught her to read and a willingness to work that no one in the Whitaker house had ever thought to question. The old man had hired her without much conversation. She had taken it as charity. She had been wrong about that, though she would not know it until the night the lawyer opened his mouth. Nora was not a person who trusted freely. She had lived long enough in houses that belonged to other people to understand the arithmetic. When those with means offer something to those without, there was always a calculation being made somewhere, by someone, that did not include you in the final sum. She did not hold this against anyone in particular. It was simply the shape of things. So she worked, and she watched, and she kept her own counsel, and she asked for nothing. The evening of August Whitaker's burial was dry and windless, which felt wrong, as though the land itself had forgotten to grieve. The family gathered in the big dining room, Wyatt, the elder son, standing near the fireplace in a black coat with his jaw set the way men set their jaws when they are holding something back by force of will. Preston, the younger brother, already talking about cattle prices before the dirt had settled. Adelaide Crane, the aunt, already asking about the silver in the locked cabinet. Nora poured coffee. That was her place. That was what she had always done. The lawyer, Silas Bell, was a small man with careful eyes and the hands of someone who had spent decades folding papers that contained other people's lives. He read through the first portions of the document in an unremarkable voice. Then he opened the second sealed envelope, and the room changed. 1/2 of Whitaker Ranch, the South Water rights, The main house, the long barn, and the cattle bearing the W brand would pass to Miss Nora Finch. The coffee pot in Nora's hand did not fall. She held it because her hands had been trained by 3 years of holding things that must not drop. But the sound that came from Preston was a short, sharp laugh, the kind a man makes when he thinks something is a joke and is not yet certain it is not. Adelaide rose from her chair as though lifted by a wire. Wyatt turned from the fireplace and looked at Nora, not the way he had ever looked at her before, not past her, at her. Silas Bell cleared his throat and read the letter that accompanied the document. Nora Finch is not a servant in this house. She is the daughter of Clara Whitaker, the woman I loved, betrayed, and allowed this town to bury in shame. The room went so quiet that the ticking of the mantel clock sounded like something being counted down. Nora took one step back. Her shoulder touched the wall. The wall, she noted distantly, was solid. That was something, because Clara Whitaker was a name that had not been spoken in this house for 23 years. And if the letter was true, if the faded photograph and the embroidered handkerchief and the whole long silence of her life pointed to what she was only now being told, then the girl who had been made to eat after the family, to enter by the kitchen door, to make herself small in every room she occupied, did not merely own half a ranch. She was blood of this house, and blood that had been buried does not stay quiet forever. The night of the reading, Nora went to her room. It was a small room off the kitchen, which had always suited the purpose it was intended for. A narrow cot, a washstand, a hook for her one good dress. She had made it tidy over 3 years the way she made everything tidy, not because she had been asked to, but because order in a small space was one of the few things that belonged entirely to her. She folded a dress, placed it in the sack she kept under the cot. She added the few coins she had saved, the old book the churchwoman had given her when she left, a spool of thread. She picked up the handkerchief last, ran her thumb over the embroidered letters, and set it on top. She was going to leave. The decision felt clean and obvious. She wanted no part of a room full of Whitakers looking at her the way Adelaide had looked at her. Not with the familiar contempt of someone dismissing a servant, but with the new and sharper contempt of someone who considered themselves robbed. She had been poor before. At least poor had been honest. Wyatt found her at the back porch door, bag in hand. He stood in the hallway in his black coat, still dressed for grief, one hand against the doorframe. He was a tall man, and he did not fill doorways the way men who wanted to intimidate filled them. He simply stood there, which was its own kind of obstruction. "You can't leave while it's unsettled," he said. Nora looked at him. "Is that concern for me, or for the half of the ranch walking out the door?" He did not answer. The silence stretched exactly long enough to be honest. "That's what I thought," she said. She had her hand on the door when he spoke again. "If you go, Preston will file to have the will declared invalid. He'll say you abandoned the claim. Everything my father tried to fix will be undone by morning." Nora stood still. She hated that he was right. She hated it the way she had hated so many true things in her life, not because they were cruel, but because they asked something of her she had not been given a choice about. If she left, Clara Whitaker would be buried a second time, and Clara had already been buried once by people who had no right to do it. She set the bag down, not on the cot, on the kitchen table, where she could see it. "I'm staying," she said, "not for the land, for her." Wyatt nodded once. "Good." He turned and walked back toward the dining room. Nora stood alone in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the house settling around her, and understood for the first time in 3 years that she was not a guest here who had overstayed. She was something the house had been trying to say out loud. The days that followed were not easy, and Nora had not expected them to be. The will gave her the right to live in the main house. She moved her things to the east room, the one with 2 windows and the peeling plaster, which May Turner, the old cook, told her in a low voice had once belonged to someone else. Nora did not ask who. She was beginning to understand. Preston wasted no time. He told the ranch hands that Nora had no authority over daily operations. He told the kitchen staff that any instructions she gave were to be checked with him. He walked through the house with the particular confidence of a man who considers property a birthright and cannot imagine the mathematics working out any other way. At the first ranch meeting of the new arrangement, he sat at the head of the long table and smiled at Nora in the way that men smile at women when they are hoping the women will be too polite to answer. "The lady's welcome to observe," he said. "But cattle don't much listen to someone who's spent 3 years listening to them." Nora set a leather-bound ledger on the table. "The cattle don't need to listen to me," she said. "The men who feed them do. And you haven't paid 3 of them their full wages in 4 months. She opened the ledger to the marked page. "I've been keeping the supply accounts since February of last year. The numbers are here, the shortfall is here, and the date the discrepancy began is here, which is the same week you started talking to the railroad about the South water rights." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one in the dining room after the will was read. That had been shock. This was recalibration. Wyatt looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Preston. Then he looked at Nora, and for the first time he was seeing her, not the apron, not the coffee pot, not the set of hands that kept the kitchen from running out of flour. He was seeing a woman who had been running the ledgers while his family argued about who deserved to sign them. Wyatt said nothing that night. But the next morning, Nora found the broken step outside the east room door had been repaired. New board, clean nails, fitted true. She had tripped on that step twice in 3 years. She had reported it once and been forgotten. He had fixed it without being asked, without saying so, which was the only kind of apology the Whitaker men seemed capable of beginning. She left a cup of coffee on his work table before she went to check the south well, not as a thank you, as an acknowledgement. There was a difference, and she suspected he would understand it. The well had been bothering her for weeks. The sound the draw rope made when the bucket dropped was not the sound it had made in summer. A fraying or a shift in the wheel's hang. Something she had reported to Preston in August and been told to leave to the men. She climbed down to the well edge in the pale morning and listened. The wheel groaned at a quarter turn. The rope was fraying where it crossed the iron lip. She was crouching there when she heard Wyatt's horse on the path. He pulled up and watched her from the saddle without speaking. "I reported this in August," she said, without turning. "I know." A pause. Preston said the well was fine. Preston has never listened to a well in his life. She stood and faced him. He looked like a man who had come to supervise and was understanding, slowly, that he was the one being shown something. "The rope wants replacing before the rains come," she said. "If it goes in winter, the south pasture cattle will have no water. Your father Sandide gave him that well, and whoever holds it, holds the pasture." Wyatt dismounted. He looked at the rope. He ran his thumb across the worn place and nodded. "I'll send Caleb with new line this afternoon. I'll be here to show him where the wheels hung crooked." He looked at her then, steady, not searching, just present. "You've known this ranch longer than you let on." "I've known it exactly as long as you have," Nora said. "You just weren't listening in the same rooms." That evening, when the dust settled purple-red over the mesa and the ranch quieted to its night sounds, horses shifting, the windmill turning its slow complaint, May Turner came to Nora's room. The old cook was past 50, thick through the shoulders, with hands like the hands of women who have done hard work long enough that soft work no longer feels honest. She sat on the edge of the cot and placed a small wooden box between them. Nora looked at it. "It was hers," May said. "I kept it when they cleared the room. I didn't have the right to keep it, but I didn't have the heart to let Adelaide have it." Inside the box was a sheet of handwritten music, notes in a precise, unhurried hand, the ink browned at the edges. A photograph, clearer than the one Nora had carried all her life. A young woman with dark hair pinned low, standing beside a piano. looking at something just past the camera's edge with an expression that was not quite a smile but was something better. A letter, folded many times, addressed to no one, and a handkerchief, embroidered with CW, in the same fine thread as Nora's own. Nora lifted the photograph. She was 22 in that picture, May said. She could play anything she heard once. She read every book in the Whitaker house and then started ordering her own. She wasn't what they said she was. What did they say? May was quiet for a moment, that she set her cap at August, that she made herself useful to him in ways that weren't proper, that when the baby came it was a trap she'd laid. The old woman shook her head. Clara didn't trap anyone. She loved him. And he loved her enough to plan to leave with her, right up until his father said the word inheritance, and August discovered he loved that too. Nora held the photograph. The light from the oil lamp made the woman in the picture flicker, almost alive. Adelaide organized a meeting, May continued, in the parlor with the whole house gathered. They made Clara stand in the middle, and they asked her in front of everyone who the father of the child was. August stood right there. And he didn't say a word. Nora's hand was very still. Clara looked at him, May said, just looked at him, and she said, "You don't have to say you love me. Just say the truth," and he didn't, and the next morning she was gone. The fire in the small grate popped softly. Outside, a night bird called once and fell silent. She didn't leave because she was weak, Nora said. No, May agreed. She left because she refused to beg. Nora set the photograph down carefully. She opened the letter. It was short, written in the same hand as the music, the same unhurried precision. "I do not hate you for refusing to speak. I hate the moment you let them call our child a trap. She is not a trap. She is the only honest thing that happened between us. I am going where no one knows the Whitaker name, and I will raise her to know that loving someone who will not stand for you is its own kind of lesson." Nora read it twice. Then she folded it back along its old creases and held it in both hands the way you hold something that has been waiting for you. Wyatt found his father's journal the following week. He had not been looking for it. Exactly. He had been looking for the original survey papers on the south pasture, which were not in the locked cabinet where they should have been. What he found instead was a small brown book on the shelf behind the false-back drawer, which was the kind of hiding place that announces itself to someone who knows the desk's architecture. He sat at his father's table and read it. August Whitaker had not been a poetic man. The entries were short, factual in the way that guilty men are factual, as though stating what happened plainly, without embellishment, might stand in for understanding it. The early pages were about cattle prices and water contracts and the annual calculations of a working ranch. And then, 5 years back, a different kind of entry. Hired a girl today from the church home in Terrell. Clara's girl. I recognized her the moment she stood in the door. She has her mother's way of holding still when she's watching something. I knew the instant she looked at me. I said nothing. I hired her and said nothing. Wyatt stopped reading. He read the sentence again. He knew her from the first day. He looked at Nora's face and knew whose daughter she was, and he put her to work in the kitchen. He fed her his shame for 3 years and called it charity. He waited until he was dying to say her name out loud, and only said it in a document she would not read until he was beyond the reach of her response. Wyatt closed the journal. He did not move for a long time. When he finally opened it again, he turned to the last entry. "She has been managing the South Supply records for 4 months without being asked. I found the ledger on the shelf in the pantry, neat as a courthouse filing. She has been watching this ranch the way Clara used to watch it, learning everything from the edges. I should have told her. I should have told her from the first morning I was afraid. I have always been afraid of the thing I owe and do not know how to pay." Wyatt set the journal on the table and covered his face with both hands. He stayed that way for a while, in the quiet of a room that still smelled faintly of his father's tobacco, a man he had loved without question, the way children love, and was only now learning to see whole. He was not weeping for the ranch. He was weeping for the 23 years his family had spent calling their own silence dignity. Preston made his moves in the way that small men with large stakes make their moves. Not boldly, but in the dark, where accountability was hard to trace. He arranged for a handful of coins to disappear from Nora's room, and then mentioned the loss in conversation at the general store, where talk moved like water. He sent a letter to the county court requesting an examination of August's mental state in the final months, citing witnesses who were mostly relatives and largely Adelaide. He began a rumor, not in any place where it could be denied directly, but in the spaces between sentences where rumor lives, that Nora Finch was a woman who had known about her mother's history all along and had positioned herself in the Whitaker house deliberately. Adelaide held a tea. It was a proper affair, in the front parlor of the Whitaker house, with the women of the church community invited and the good china used, and the implication thick in the air that order was being restored. Adelaide placed a chair for Nora near the door, between the window and the coat rack, the kind of chair that communicates position without having to say so. Nora came. She stood in the middle of the room. "I didn't come to ask permission," she said, "to have the blood I was born with." One of the women said, in a tone that was meant to sound reasonable, that blood alone did not establish a claim to property. "You're right," Nora said. "It doesn't." She placed Clara's letter on the tea table among the cakes and the careful silver spoons. "But blood establishes truth, and the Whitaker family has been a long time without it." Another woman said something about the letter being unverifiable, about poor women and their grievances, about the importance of maintaining what had been built. Nora looked at her steadily. If my mother was the liar they said she was, why did they need to hide so many papers to prove it? The room did not have an answer. Adelaide's cup clicked against its saucer. The tea went cold. Nora left without waiting to see who spoke next. The night of the storm, Preston showed what he was willing to do when afraid. The South Wells draw rope had been replaced 2 weeks prior, on Nora's instruction, with new line properly fitted. What no one had replaced was the gate latch on the south pasture fence, which Nora had also reported, and which Preston had ignored because attending to it would have required acknowledging that she had been right about the well. When the dust storm came in fast off the mesa, the kind that arrives in the hour before midnight with a sound like breathing through cloth, the old latch gave way. Nora heard it. She heard it because she knew that fences sounds the way she knew the wells sounds, which was the result of 3 years of walking the perimeter while other people slept. She was at Wyatt's door before he had finished pulling on his boots. The south gate's open. The herd's going to run east toward the dry creek bed. There's a new hand who was camping near the crossing. She did not wait for him to argue. She was already at the barn. What followed was not heroic in any clean sense. It was loud and dusty and frightening, and it smelled of panicked cattle and red grit. Nora rode out with her skirt torn from catching on the saddle horn, her hair coming down in the wind, shouting directions to Caleb Ross, and 2 ranch hands who had the good sense to follow someone who knew which way the land tilted in the dark. They found the new hand, a boy not yet 20, pinned against the dry creek bank by a steer who had lost its nerve, and they drove the herd back through the mess of dust and lantern light and Nora's voice carrying over it all. When it was over, and the gate was rehung, and the cattle counted, and the boy sitting with a blanket and a cup of water that he didn't drink because his hands were still shaking, the men stood in a loose cluster in the lamplit yard. Wyatt looked at Nora. She was dismounting, one hand on the saddle, catching her breath. "The well was sabotaged," Caleb said quietly. "Not the rope. The crank was cut partway through. It would have failed in a week, maybe 2. Made to look like where?" "Who had access to the well shed?" Wyatt asked. Nobody answered. But Preston's workshop key was known to hang on the peg in the main house hall, and the file marks on the crank were fresh. Wyatt turned to the assembled men. His voice was level and did not need to be raised. This woman just saved your youngest colleague and a third of the South herd. If anyone in this yard has a question about her authority to direct operations on the land her name is on, settle it now, or be gone before the sun comes up." Caleb Ross took his hat from his head and nodded at Nora. The others followed. Adelaide broke in the parlor. It was Nora who broke her, though not by force, by a single piece of paper. She placed the transfer document on the parlor table, the one Silas Bell had produced from the second sealed envelope, August document assigning the South water rights to Clara Whitaker before she left Red Mesa. The document that had never been delivered because Adelaide had intercepted the letter. "If my mother was a deceiver," Nora said, "why did you need to steal her mail?" Adelaide's composure was a remarkable thing, built over decades of social architecture, of knowing which rooms to enter and which conversations to redirect and how to make cruelty sound like propriety. It held for a long moment, then it did not hold. She said she had done it to protect the family. She said Clara had been making August behave recklessly. She said she had been the only one thinking clearly. She said she had told August that Clara had left with someone else, that she had manufactured a story to make Clara's departure final, so that August would not go after her. Wyatt was at the doorway. He had not been hiding. He had been listening the way a man listens when he needs to hear something he already knows before he can act on it. He said, "You told my father she left with another man." Adelaide turned to him. "I did what was necessary." "You let him spend 20 years thinking she chose to go." His voice did not waver. "You let him hire her daughter as a kitchen maid rather than tell him the truth was standing in his own house." "I protected this family?" "No," Wyatt said. "You protected the name. There's a difference, and it cost more than you'll ever understand." Adelaide left 3 days later for a cousin's house in San Antonio. She went quietly, which was somehow worse than if she had gone with argument. Nora watched the wagon from the East Room window and felt nothing she needed to name. The county court convened on a Thursday, which was a market day, which meant the town was already gathered, and the courtroom filled beyond its usual capacity with people who had legitimate business, and people who had heard there was a Whitaker matter being decided and considered that equivalent. Preston's lawyers arrived with documents and arguments, and the composed air of men who believe that volume of paper establishes truth. They said August had been in failing health. They said Nora's presence in the house had been improper. They said a woman without formal education or legal standing could not manage a property of this scope. They said the ledgers were circumstantial. They said the water transfer document was of uncertain validity, given that it had never been formally recorded. Nora did not wear anything borrowed or newly purchased. She wore a dress she had made herself, clean and plain, without ornamentation. She carried the documents in a leather case Caleb Ross had lent her without comment. May Turner testified. Silas Bell testified. Caleb testified about the well, the crank, the file marks. The young ranch hand testified about the open gate and who had been near the south fence in the days before the storm. Then Preston's lawyers made a final argument. They said that Nora had lived in the Whitaker house for 3 years without anyone recognizing her as belonging to it, that this itself was evidence she did not belong to it. Nora stood. The room was quiet enough that her chair scraping the floor seemed loud. "I cooked their meals," she said. "I washed their clothes. I kept the supply records, the kitchen accounts, and the well maintained through 3 seasons while the family managed its grief. I was called the kitchen girl. I was told to use the back door. I was given a room off the scullery and was never invited to sit at the table I set every morning, and you are asking this court whether I belong to that house." She looked at the judge. "I will ask something different. How long must a person hold a house together before the house admits she's there?" The room did not answer. The judge wrote something in his record. Wyatt was the last to testify. He stood without notes. "My father was wrong to bring Nora into this house without telling her the truth. My family was wrong to build its reputation on a story that required Clara Whitaker to be a liar. I was wrong to look past a woman who was doing the work of this ranch without recognition, because I had never been asked to look. If this court is asking whether Nora Finch has the right to hold what August Whitaker left her, I'll say this. She has been holding Whitaker Ranch for 3 years already. The only thing that has changed is whether the paper says so. The judge ruled on Friday morning. The will was valid. The water transfer document, properly entered into the record, was valid. The claim of sabotage was referred for investigation. Preston would answer separately for the tampering and for the 3 months of back wages. When the ruling was read, the room broke into sound. Nora stood where she was and let it pass around her like water around a stone. Afterward, in the dusty street outside the courthouse, a woman who had been at Adelaide's tea approached Nora. She had come to the hearing with her hat pinned correctly, and her gloves buttoned, and the expression of a person who has spent the morning reconsidering things. "We were unkind to you," she said. "I hope you can see your way to." "The back door of Whitaker Ranch is still there," Nora said. "If you come to visit, you're welcome to use it. It'll remind you how the view looks from that side." She said it without malice. The woman flushed and did not answer. Nora did not wait for one. The ranch changed in the weeks that followed, the way land changes after water finally reaches it. Not all at once, but steadily in the right directions. Nora did not take Adelaide's parlor. She did not move into the large front bedroom or rearrange the furniture or put her name on anything in the main house that had not already been hers by labor. What she did was simpler. She asked Caleb to post the wage schedule openly in the bunkhouse so every man could see what was owed and when. She settled the account at the general store. She split the South Water Agreement more fairly with the 2 smaller ranches downstream that Preston had been squeezing since spring. She had Clara's photograph, the clear one from May's box, the young woman looking at something beyond the frame, mounted in the main hallway, where August's portrait had always hung alone. She opened the east room that had been locked since Clara left. It had a piano in it, not a grand one, but a good one, dark wood, keys yellowed at the edges. Someone had kept it covered with a linen cloth all these years, which meant someone had believed it might be played again. Nora did not play piano, but she left the cover off. One evening, when the ranch had settled into its late autumn rhythm and the air had turned cool enough that the fire in the kitchen felt necessary rather than optional, Wyatt came to her with a question. He said it quietly, the way he said most things that mattered. They were at the kitchen table, the last of the daylight going thin through the window. "You said you wanted to build something near the south well. You said every wall in the main house reminds you of a different way you were asked to be small." "I said something like that. I've been thinking about it." He did not look away from her. "If you build there, what do you want?" Nora considered this. "A door that faces east." He nodded. "So you see the sun come up, so I choose which way I'm facing." "Monday," he said, "I'll start on the foundation." She looked at him for a long moment. He had said, "I'll start," not "I'll have someone start." The distinction was not lost on her. Neither was the fact that he had not said anything about whether the house would have 1 room or 2, or whether the name on the door would be hers alone. "Monday," she agreed. They built it together in the weeks before winter settled in properly, Wyatt cutting timber and fitting the frame, Nora measuring and recording and making the small decisions that accumulate into a house's character. She chose where the shelves would go, which wall would hold the window box, how wide the porch boards needed to be for a chair to sit level. He built what she decided without altering it, which was a form of respect she had not known she was waiting for. In the evenings, they sometimes sat on the unfinished porch frame in the dark with the south well nearby and the mesa black and wide overhead. One night she asked him the question she had been carrying since autumn. "Do you love me, or are you trying to settle a debt your father left?" He did not answer immediately. The wind moved through the dry grass. When this started, he said, "I stood by you because my father owed you. Then because my family owed you. Then because the right thing and the useful thing had, for once, lined up the same direction." He paused. "But I'm still here because when you're not in the room, I still turn to say something to you. And there's no one there." Nora looked at the well in the dark, at the water that had been her mother's, that was now hers, that sat quiet and cold in the ground, regardless of what any deed said about it. "I don't want to be loved like a debt," she said. "Then I'll wait until it doesn't feel like one." The house was finished in early spring. Wyatt brought her to it at first light, when the sky was pale and wide and the mesa smelled of wet earth from the night's rain. He had carved something into the door lintel, not Whitaker, not a date, not her mother's initials or her father's name, 2 words, Nora's place. She stood at the door and put her hand flat against the carved letters, and for a long moment she did not speak. The wood was smooth under her palm, the letters deep enough to last. "You've been placed your whole life," he said, "behind the table, below the threshold, after everyone else. I wanted the first thing you owned to have your name on the door first." He reached into his coat pocket. Not the ring from the locked cabinet, not the Whitaker family piece that had passed from his grandmother's finger to his mother's, to the drawer where it sat like a claim. This was something else. Small, plain silver. "I had it made from the spoon," he said. She looked at it. She knew which spoon he meant, the heavy silver one from the dining room set, the one that had sat at the head of the table she had set 1,000 mornings and never sat down to. "I melted it down," he said. "It seemed right. Something that was used to keep you on one side of a door, made into something for your hand." He held it out, not slipped onto her finger, not assumed, held out flat on his palm for her to take or not take. "I'm not asking you to become a Whitaker," he said. "I know what that name cost your mother. I'm asking Nora Finch whether she'll let me sit at her table." Nora looked at the ring, at the house, at the south well catching the first light, at the man standing at the edge of what he had built for her, asking permission to stay. "I'll marry you," she said, "but the house keeps its name. I'll clean the sign every week," he said. She almost smiled. "I'll hold you to that." They were married on a clear morning in early May, beside the south well, with the red mesa at their backs and the light coming from the east the way Nora had always wanted it to come. May Turner helped her dress. Caleb Ross stood beside Wyatt. Silas Bell bore witness. A half-dozen ranch hands stood at a respectful distance with their hats in their hands, and the horses in the south pasture moved quietly in the background as if they understood the occasion called for it. There was no Adelaide. There was no Preston. Before the ceremony, Nora placed the handkerchief, her mother's, with the initials C.W. in fine thread, into the small wooden box from May's keeping. She wrote a note on a slip of paper and folded it inside. Clara Whitaker did not disappear. She came home through her daughter. She closed the box and set it on the shelf she had chosen for it, inside the house that bore her name. The wedding meal was held in the yard. Long tables set end to end in the afternoon light. Ranch hands and kitchen staff and 2 neighbors from the downstream properties sat at the same tables. Nora did not sit at the head. She sat in the middle, where she could hear every conversation and be reached from any side. Wyatt sat next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched. No speeches were made. There was beef and bread and something sweet that May had made from the last of the winter preserves. The men ate and talked, and someone found a fiddle, and the evening stretched long and comfortable into the dark. Afterward, when the last lamps were lit along the main house and the ranch breathed in its slow nightly rhythm, horses, windmill, the creak of the long barn, Nora stood on the porch of her house and watched the fire through the window. Wyatt brought 2 cups of coffee out and set one beside her without being asked. The south well was quiet in the dark. The cattle moved somewhere beyond the fence line, slow and untroubled. In the main house, Clara's photograph hung in the hallway where the Whitaker name had always presided alone, and the piano in the east room sat with its cover off, patient as a promise. Some people come into the world with their names already written on the door. Others spend their lives holding the house up from the inside, keeping the fire, balancing the books, doing the necessary and unremarked work that makes a home possible, and are never asked to sit down. What August Whitaker tried to correct in the final hour of his life, Nora Finch had already been correcting for 3 years with her hands and her ledger, and her refusal to believe that the back door was all she deserved. She did not become a Whitaker. She made the Whitakers learn what it cost to finally deserve what they already had. And in the end, the only thing engraved on the door that mattered was her name. Not the name she had been given, but the name she had earned the only way a name is ever truly earned, by staying when it would have been easier to go, and building something that faced the sunrise. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.